The Greek Interpreter. During my long and intimate acquaintance with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I had never heard him refer to his relations, and hardly ever to his own early life. This reticence upon his part had increased the somewhat inhuman effect which he produced upon me, until sometimes I found myself regarding him as an isolated phenomenon, a brain without a heart, a deficient in human sympathy as he is preeminent in intelligence. His aversion to women and his disinclination to form any friendships were both typical and his unemotional character, but not more so than his complete suppression of every reference to his own people. I'd come to believe that he was an orphan with no living relatives, but one day, to my very great surprise, he began to talk to me about his brother. It was after tea one summer evening, and the conversation, which had roamed in a desultory, spasmodic fashion from golf clubs to the causes of the change in the obliquity of the ecliptic, came around to the question of atavism and hereditary aptitudes. It's hard to say. The point under discussion was how far any singular gift in an individual was due to his ancestry, and how far to his own early training. In your own case, said I, from all that you have told me, it seems obvious that your faculty of observation and your peculiar facility for deduction are due to your own systematic training. To some extent, he answered thoughtfully. My ancestors were country squires, who appear to have led much the same life as is natural to their class. But none the less, my turn that way is in my veins, and may have come with my grandmother, who was the sister of Vernet, a French artist. Art in the blood is liable to take the strangest forms. But how do you know it is hereditary? Because my brother Mycroft possesses it in a larger degree than I do. This was news to me, indeed. If there were another man with such singular powers in England, how was it that neither police nor public had heard of him? I put the question, with a hint that it was my companion's modesty which made him acknowledge his brother as his superior. Holmes laughed at my suggestion. My dear Watson, said he, I cannot agree with those who rank modesty among my virtues. To the logician, all things should be seen equally as they are, and to the underestimates one's self as much as in departure from the truth as to exaggerate one's own powers. When I say, therefore, that Mycroft has better powers of observation than I, you may take it that I am speaking to the exact and the literal truth. Is he your junior? 7 years my senior. How comes it that he is unknown? Oh, he is very well known, in his own circle. Where then? Well, in the Diogenes Club, for example. I had never heard of the institution, and my face must have proclaimed as much, for Sherlock Holmes pulled out his watch. The Diogenes Club is the queerest club in London, and Mycroft one of the queerest men. He's always there from 5:15 to 8:20. It's 6 now, so if you care for a stroll to this beautiful evening, I shall very much be happy to introduce you to your curiosities. 5 minutes later, we were in the street, walking towards Regent's Circus. You wonder, said my companion, why it is that Mycroft does not use his powers for detective work. He is incapable of it. But I thought you said... I said that he is my superior in observation and deduction. And the art of the detective began and ended in reasoning from an armchair. My brother would live to be the greatest criminal agent that ever lived. But he has no ambition and no energy. He will not even go out of his way to verify his own solutions, and would rather be considered wrong than to take the trouble to prove himself right. Again and again I have taken a problem to him, and have received an explanation which has afterwards proved to be the correct one. And yet he is absolutely incapable of working out the practical points which must be gone into before a case could be laid out before a judge or jury. Is it not his profession, then? By no means. What it is to me a means of livelihood is to him the merest hobby of a dilettante. He has an extraordinary facilities for figures and audits of books in some of the government departments. Mycroft lodges in Pall Mall, and he walks around every corner to Whitehall every morning and back every evening. From the year's end to year's end he takes no other exercise, and it is seen nowhere else, except only in the Diogenes room, which is just the opposite of his rooms. I cannot recall the name. Very likely not. There are many men in London, you know, who, some from shyness, some from misanthropy, have no wish for the company of the fellows. Yet they are not adverse to comfortable chairs in the latest periodicals. It is for the convenience of these that the Diogenes Club was started, and it was now considered unsociable and unclubbable men of town. No member is permitted to take the least notice of the other one, save in the strangers' room. No talking is, under any circumstances, allowed, and 3 offences, if brought to the notice of the committee, render the talker liable of expulsion. My brother was one of the founders, and I have found myself a very soothing atmosphere. An introvert social club. Cool. We had reached Pall Mall as we talked, and we were walking down it from the St. James End. Sherlock Holmes stopped at a door a little distance from the Carlton, and, cautioning me not to speak, he led the way into the hall. Through the glass panelling I caught a glimpse of a large and luxurious room in which a considerable number of men were sitting about and reading papers, each in his own little nook. Holmes showed me into a small chamber which looked out into Pall Mall, and then, leaving me for a moment, he came back with a companion whom I knew could only be his brother. Mycroft Holmes was a much larger and stouter man than Sherlock. His body was absolutely corpulent, but his face, though massive, had preserved something of the sharpness of expression which was so remarkable in that of his brother. His eyes, which were a particularly light, watery grey, seemed to always retain that far-away, introspective look which I had only observed in Sherlock Holmes's, when he was exerting his full powers. "I am very glad to meet you, sir," said he, putting out the broad, fat hand like the flipper of a seal. "I hear Sherlock everywhere since you became his chronicler. By the way, Sherlock, I expected to see you around last week to consult me over that Manor House case. I thought you might be a little out of your depth." "No, I solved it," said my friend, smiling. "It was Adams, of course." "Yes, it was Adams." "I was sure of it from the first." The two sat down together in a bow window of the club. "To anyone who wishes to study mankind, this is the spot," said Mycroft. "Look at the magnificent types. Look at these 2 men who are coming towards us, for example." "The billiard-maker and the other?" "Precisely. What do you make of the other?" The 2 men had stopped opposite the window. Some chalk marks over the waistcoat pocket were the only signs of billiards which I could see in it of them. The other was a very small, dark fellow with his hat pushed back and several packages under his arm. "An old soldier, I perceive," said Sherlock. "And very recently discharged," remarked his brother. "Served in India, I see. And a non-commissioned officer. Royal Artillery, I fancy," said Sherlock. "And a widower, but with a child. Children, my boy, children." "Come," said I, laughing, "this is a little too much." "Surely," answered Holmes. "It is not hard to say that the man with the bearing, expressing of authority, and sun-baked skin is a soldier, is more than a private, and not long from India. That he has not left the service very long is shown by his still wearing his ammunition boots, as they are called, observed Mycroft. And he had not a heavy cavalry stride, yet he wore his hat on one side, as is shown by the lighter skin on the side of his brow. His weight is against his being a sapper. He is in the artillery. Then, of course, his complete mourning shows that he has lost someone very dear. That he is doing his own shopping looks as though it were his wife. He has been buying things for children, you perceive. There's a rattle, which shows that one of them is very young. The wife probably died in the childbed. The fact that he has a picture book under his arm shows that there is another child that ought to be thought of. I began to wonder what my friend meant when he said that his brother possessed even keener facilities than he did himself. He glanced across to me and smiled. Mycroft took snuff from a tortoiseshell box and brushed away the wandering grains from his coat fronts with a large red silk handkerchief. By the way, Sherlock, said he, I have had something quite after your own heart, a most singular problem, submitted to my judgment. I really had not the energy to follow it up, save for the incomplete fashion, but it gave me the basis for some pleasing speculations. If you would care to hear the facts. My dear Mycroft, I should be delighted. The brother scribbled a note upon the leaf of a pocket-book, and, ringing the bell, he handed it to the waiter. I have asked Mr. Miles to step across, said he. He lodges on the floor above me, and I have some slight acquaintance with him, which led him to come to me in his perplexity. Mr. Miles is a Greek by extraction, and, as I understand, he is a remarkable linguist. He earns his living partly as interpreter in the law courts, and partly by acting as guide to any wealthy Orientals who may visit the Northumberland Avenue hotels. I think I will leave him to tell this very remarkable experience in his own fashion. A few minutes later, we were joined by a short, stout man whose olive face and coal-black hair proclaimed his southern origin. Though his speech was that of an educated Englishman, he shook hands eagerly with Sherlock Holmes, and his dark eyes sparkled with pleasure when he understood that a specialist was anxious to hear his story. I do not believe that the police credit me. On my word, I do not, said he in a wailing voice. Just because they have never heard of it before, they think that such a thing cannot be. But I know I shall never be easy in my mind until I know what has become of my poor man with the sticking plaster upon his face. I am all attention, said Sherlock Holmes. This is Wednesday evening, said Mr. Miles. Well, then, it was Monday night, only 2 days ago, as you understand, that this all happened. I'm an interpreter, and perhaps my neighbor there has told you. I interpret languages, or nearly all, but I am Greek by birth and with a Grecian name. It is often associated tongue that I am principally associated. For many years I have been the chief Greek interpreter in London, and my name is very well known in the hotels. It happens not infrequently that I am sent for at strange hours by foreigners who get into difficulties, or by travelers who arrive late and wish my services. I was not surprised, therefore, on Monday night when a Mr. Latimer, a very fashionably dressed young man, came up to my room and asked me to accompany him in a cab, which was waiting at the door. A Greek friend had come to see him upon business, he said, and as he could not speak anything but his own tongue, the services of an interpreter were indispensable. He gave me to understand that his house was some distance off, in Kensington, and he seemed to be in a great hurry, bustling me rapidly into a cab when we had descended to the street. I say into a cab, but I soon became doubtful to whether it was not a carriage in which I found myself. It was certainly more roomy than an ordinary four-wheeled disgrace to London, and the fittings, though frayed, were of rich quality. Mr. Latimer seated himself opposite me, and we started off in Charing Cross and up the Shaftesbury Avenue. We had come out Oxford Street, and I had ventured some remark as to the little giggling laughs in between, but somehow he impressed me with fear more than the other. "What do you want with me?" I asked. "Only ask a few questions of a Greek gentleman who is visiting us, and to let us have the answers, but say no more than you are told to say, or—" It came to a nervous giggle again. "You had better never have been born." As he spoke, he opened the door and showed me the way into the building, which appeared to be very richly furnished, but again the only light was afforded by a single lamp half turned down. The chamber was certainly large, and the way in which my feet sank into the carpet as I stepped across it told me of its richness. I caught glimpses of velvet chairs, a high white marble mantelpiece, and what seemed to be a suit of Japanese armor on one side of it. Ouch. Thank you. There was a chair just under the lamp, and the elderly man motioned that I should sit in it. The younger had left us, but he had suddenly returned as though from another door, leading with him a gentleman clad in some sort of loose dressing gown, who moved slowly towards us. As he came into the circle of dim light which enabled him to be seen more clearly, I was thrilled with horror at his appearance. He was deadly pale and terribly emaciated, with the protruding brilliant eyes of a man whose spirit was greater than that of his strength. But what shocked me more was that any signs of weakness was that his face was grotesquely crisscrossed with sticking plaster, and that one large pad of it was fastened over his mouth. "Have you the slate, Harold?" cried the older man, as the strange being fell rather than sat down into a chair. "Our tenant's loose. Now, then, give him the pencil. You are to ask the questions, Mr. Mellis, and he will write the answers. Ask him first of all whether he is prepared to sign the papers." The man's eyes flashed fire. "Never," he wrote in Greek upon the slate. "On no conditions?" I asked at the bidding of our tyrant. "Only if I see her married in the presence of a Greek priest whom I know." The man giggled in his venomous way. "You know what awaits you, then? I care nothing for myself." These are samples of the questions and answers which made up our strange half-spoken, half-written conversation. Again and again I had to ask him whether he would give in and sign the documents. Again and again I had the same indignant reply. But soon as a happy thought came to me, I took to adding on little sentences of my own to each question. Innocent ones at first, to test whether either of our companions knew anything of the matter, and then, as I found that they showed no sign, I played a more dangerous game. Our conversation ran something more like this: "You can do no good by this obstinacy. Who are you?" "I cannot. I am a stranger in London." "Your fate will be on your own head. How long have you been here?" "Let it be so. 3 weeks." "The property can never be yours. What ails you?" "It shall not go to villains. They are starving me." "You shall go free if you sign. What house is this?" "I will never sign. I do not know." "You are not doing her any service. What is your name?" "Let me hear her say so." "Cratides." "You shall see her if you sign." "Where are you from?" "Then I shall never see her." "Athens." Another 5 minutes, Mr. Holmes, and I should have wormed out the whole story from their very noses. My very next question might have cleared the matter up, but at an instant the door opened and a woman stepped into the room. I could not see her clearly enough to know more than she was tall and graceful, with black hair, and clad in some sort of loose white gown. "Harold," she said, speaking English with a broken accent, "I cannot stay away longer. It is only lonely up there, and you... Oh, my God! It is Paul!" His last three words were in Greek, and at the same instant the man, with a convulsive effort, tore the plaster from his lips, and screaming out, "Sophie! Sophie!" rushed into the woman's arms. Their embrace was but for an instant, however, for the younger man seized the woman and pushed her out of the room, while the elder easily overpowered his emaciated victim and dragged him away through the other door. For a moment I was left alone in the room, and I sprang to my feet with some vague idea that I might in some way get a clue to what this house was in which I had found myself. Fortunately, however, I took no steps, for looking up I saw that the older man was standing in the doorway, with his eyes fixed upon me. "That will do, Mr. Mellis," said he. "You perceive that we have taken you into the confidence over some very private business. We should not have troubled you, only that our friend who speaks Greek and who began these negotiations has been forced to return to the East. It was quite necessary for us to find someone to take his place, and we were fortunate in hearing of your powers." I bowed. "There are 5 sovereigns here," said he, walking up to me, "which will, I hope, be a sufficient fee. But remember," he added, tapping me lightly on the chest and giggling, "if you speak to a human soul about this, one human soul, well, may God have mercy upon your soul." I cannot tell you the loathing and horror with which the insignificant-looking man inspired me. I could see him better now as the lamplight shone upon him. His features were peaky and shallow, and his little pointed beard was thready and ill-nourished. He pushed his face forward as he spoke, with his lips and eyelids were confidently twitching like a man with St. Vitus's disease. I could not help thinking that his strange, catchy little laugh was also a symptom of this nervous malady. The terror of his face lay in his eyes, however, steel gray, and glistening coldly with the malignant, inexorable cruelty in their depths. "We shall know if you speak of this," he said. "We have our own means of information. Now, you will find the carriage waiting, and my friend will see you to your way." I was hurried through the hall and into the vehicle, again obtaining the momentary glimpse of the trees and the garden. Mr. Latimer followed closely at my heels and took his place opposite me without a word. In silence we again drove for indeterminable distance, with the windows raised, until at last, just after midnight, the carriage pulled up. "You will get out here, Mr. Mellis," said my companion. "I am sorry to leave you so far from your house, but there is no alternative. Any attempt upon your part to follow the carriage can only lead in injury to yourself." He opened the door as he spoke, and I had hardly time to spring out when the coachman lashed the horse, and the carriage rattled away. I looked around me in astonishment. I was on some sort of heathy common mottled over with clumps of furberries bushes. Far away stretched a line of houses with a light here and there in the upper windows. On the other side I saw red signal lamps of a railway. The carriage which had brought me was already out of sight. I stood gazing around and wondering where I was, when I saw something coming towards me in the darkness. He came up to me, and I made out that he was a railway porter. Can you tell me where this place is? I asked. Wandsworth Common, said he. Can I get a train into town? If you walk on a mile or so to Chaplin Junction, he said, you'll be just in time for the last of Victoria. So, that was the end of my adventure, Mr. Holmes. I do not know where I was, nor whom I spoke with, nor said anything save what I have told you. But I know that there is foul play going on, and I want to help that unhappy man if I can. I told the whole story to Mr. Mycroft Holmes next morning, and subsequently to the police. We all sat in silence for some little while after listening to this extraordinary narrative. Then Sherlock looked across at his brother. Any steps? He asked. Mycroft picked up the Daily News, which was lying on the side table. Anybody supplying any information as to where the whereabouts of the Greek gentleman named Paul Crates from Athens who is unable to speak English will be rewarded. A similar reward paid to anyone giving information about the Greek lady whose first name is Sophie, X2473. That was in the dailies, but no answer. How about the Greek legislation? I have inquired. They know nothing. A wire to the head of the Athens police, then. Sherlock has all the energy of the family, said Mycroft, turning to me. Well, you take up the case by all means and let me know if you do any good. Certainly, answered my friend, rising from his chair. I'll let you know. And Mr. Mealis, in the meantime, Mr. Mealis, I would certainly be on my guard if I were you. For, of course, they must know that these advertisements that you have betrayed them. As we walked home together, Holmes stopped at a telegraph and sent off a few wires. You see, Watson, he remarked, our evening has been by no means wasted. Some of my most interesting cases have come to me by this way through Mycroft. The problem which we have just listened to, although it can admit that but one explanation, has still some distinguished features. You have hopes of solving it? Well, knowing as much as we do, it will be a singular indeed if we fail to discover the rest. You must yourself have formed some theory which will explain the facts to which we have listened. In a vague way, yes. What was your idea, then? It seemed to me obvious that this Greek girl had been carried off by the young Englishman named Harold Latimer. Carried off from where? Athens, perhaps? Sherlock Holmes shook his head. This young man could not talk a word of Greek. The lady could talk English fairly well. Inference that she had been in England for some time, but he had not been to Greece. Well, then, we'll presume that she had come once on a visit to England, and that thus Harold had persuaded her to fly with him. That is more probable. Then the brother, for that, I fancy, must be the relationship. Comes over from Greece to interfere. He impudently puts himself into the power of the young man and his older associate. They seize him and use violence to persuade him in order to make him sign some papers to make over the girl's fortune, of which he may be the trustee to them. This he refuses to do. In order to negotiate with him, they have to get an interpreter, and they pitch this upon Mr. Mealis, having used some other one before. The girl is not told of the arrival of her brother, and finds it out with the merest accident. Excellent, Watson, cried Holmes. I really fancy that you are not far from the truth. You see that we hold all the cards, and we have only to fear some sudden act of vengeance on their part. If they give us time, we must have them. But how can we find ourselves where this house lies? Well, if your conjecture is correct, the girl's name is or was Sophocrates. We should have no difficulty in tracing her. That must be our main hope, for her brother is, of course, a complete stranger. It is clear that some time has elapsed since Harold established his relations with the girl, some weeks at any rate, since the brother in Greece has had time to hear of it and come across. If they have been living in the same place during this time, it is probable that we shall have some answer to Mycroft's advertisements. We had reached our house in Baker Street when we had been talking. Holmes ascended to the stair first, and as he opened the door to our room, he gave a start of surprise. Looking over his shoulder, I was equally astonished. His brother Mycroft was sitting smoking in his armchair. I think sound alerts are turned off. Yeah, sound alerts are turned off. Oops. Come in, Sherlock. Come in, sir, said blandly, smiling at our surprised faces. You don't expect much energy from me, do you, Sherlock? But somehow this case attracts me. How did you get here? I passed you at a hansom. There has been some new developments? I had an answer for the advertisement. Ah, yes, it came within a few minutes of your leaving. And to what effect? Mycroft Holmes took out the sheet of paper. Here it is, said he, written with a J pen on royal cream paper by a middle-aged man with a weak constitution. Sir, he says, in answer to your advertisement in today's date, I beg you to inform you that I know the young lady in question very well. If you should care to call upon me, I will give you some particulars to be her painful history. She is living at present at the Myrtles in Beckingham. Yours truly, J. Davenport. He writes from Lower Brixton, said Mycroft Holmes. Do you not think that we might drive to him now, Sherlock, and learn these particulars? My dear Mycroft, the brother's life is more valuable than the sister's story. I think we should call at Scotland Yard for Inspector Gregson, and straight out for Beckenham. We know that a man is being done to death, and every hour may be vital. We'd better pick up Mr. Miles on our way, I suggested. We may need an interpreter. Excellent, said Sherlock Holmes. Send the boy for the four-wheeler, and we shall be off at once. He opened the table drawer as we spoke, and I noticed that he slipped his revolver into his pocket. Yes, said he in his answer to my glance. I should say, from what we have heard, that we are dealing with a particularly dangerous man. It was almost dark before we found ourselves in Pall Mall at the rooms of Mr. Miles. A gentleman had called for him, and he was gone. Can you tell me where? Asked Mycroft Holmes. I don't know, sir, answered the woman who had opened the door. I only know that he drove away with the gentleman in the carriage. Did the gentleman have a name? No, sir. He wasn't a tall, handsome, dark young man. Oh, no, sir. He was a little gentleman with glasses, thin in the face, but very pleasant in his ways, for he was laughing all the time that he was talking. Come along, cried Sherlock Holmes abruptly. This grows serious. He observed as we drove to Scotland Yard. These men have got a hold of Miles again. He is a man of no physical courage, as they have well aware from the experience from the other night. This villain is able to terrorize him in an instant that he got into his presence. No doubt that he wants his professional services, but having used them, they may be inclined to punish him for what they will regard as his treachery. But our hope is that, by taking train, we might get to Breckenham sooner than the carriage, on reaching Scotland Yard. However, it was more than an hour before we were able to get Inspector Gregson to comply with the legal formalities which would enable us to enter the house. It was 10:15 before we reached London Bridge, and 4:30 before the four of us alighted on the Beckenham platform. A drive of half a mile brought us to the Myrtles, a large dark house standing back off from the road on its own grounds. Here we discovered our cab, and we made our way up the drive together. "The windows are all dark," remarked the inspector. "The house seems deserted." "Our birds have flown, the nest empty," said Holmes. "Why do you say that?" "A carriage heavily loaded with luggage has passed during the last hour." The inspector laughed. "I saw the wheel tracks and the light of the gas lamp, but where does the luggage come in?" "You may have observed that the same wheel tracks going the other way, but the outward ones were very much deeper, so much so that we can say certainly that there were a very considerable weight on the carriage." "You get a trifle beyond me there," said the inspector, shrugging his shoulders. "It will not be an easy door to force, but we will try if we cannot make someone hear us." We hammered loudly at the knocker and pulled at the bell, but without success. Holmes had slipped away, but he came back in a few moments. "I have a window open," said he. "It is a mercy that you are on the side of the force and not against us, Mr. Holmes," remarked the inspector, as he noted the clever way in which my friend had forced back the catch. "Well, I think that under the circumstances we may enter without an invitation." One after the other, we made our way into the large apartment, which was evidently that in which Mr. Melis had found himself. The inspector had lit the lantern, and by its light we could see that the two doors, the curtain, the lamp, and the suit of Japanese mail was as described by them. On the table lay 2 glasses, 1 empty brandy bottle, and the remains of a meal. "What is that?" asked Holmes quietly. We all stood still and listened. A low moaning sound was coming from somewhere over our heads. Holmes rushed for the door and ran out into the hall. The dismal noise came from upstairs. He dashed up, the inspector and I at his heels, while his brother Mycroft followed us as quickly as his great bulk would permit. 3 doors faced us on the second floor, and it was from the central that we heard the sinister sounds that were issuing, striking sometimes into a dull mumble and rising again into a shrill whine. It was locked, but the key had been left on at the outside. Holmes flung open the door and rushed in, but he was out again in an instant, with his hand to his throat. "It's charcoal," he cried. "Give it time. It will clear." Peering in, we could see that the only light in the room was from a dull blue flame which flickered from a small brass tripod in the center. It threw a livid, unnatural circle on the floor, while the shadows beyond we saw a vague loom of 2 figures which crouched against the wall. From the open door we reeked of a horrible poisonous exhalation which set us gasping and coughing. Holmes rushed to the top of the stairs to draw in the fresh air, and then, dashing into the room, he threw open the window and hurled a brazen tripod out into the garden. "We can enter in a minute," he gasped, darting out again. "Where's a candle? I doubt if we strike a match in that atmosphere. Hold the light at the door, and we shall get them out, Mycroft. Now!" With a rush, we got to the poisoned men and dragged them out into the well-lit hall. Both of them were blue-lipped and insensible, with swollen, congested faces and protruding eyes. Indeed, so distorted were their features that, save for his black beard and stout figure, we might have failed to recognize one of them as the Greek interpreter, who had parted from us only a few hours before at the Diogenes Club. His hands and feet were securely strapped together, and he bore over one eye the marks of a violent blow. The other, who was secured in a similar fashion, was a tall man in the last stage of emaciation, with several strips of sticking plaster arranged in a grotesque pattern over his face. He had ceased to moan as we laid him down, and at a glance showed me that for him, at least our aid had not come too late. Mr. Millis, however, survived, and in less than an hour, with the aid of ammonia and brandy, I had the satisfaction of seeing him open his eyes, and of knowing that my hand had drawn him back from that dark valley in which all paths meet. It was a simple story which he had to tell, and one which did but confirm our own deductions. His visitor, on entering his rooms, had drawn a life-preserver from his sleeve, and had so impressed him with the fear of a notable death, that he kidnapped him for a second time. Indeed, it was almost mesmeric, the effect which this giggling ruffian had produced upon the unfortunate linguist, for he could not speak of him save with trembling hands and a blanched cheek. He had been taken swiftly to Beckenham, and had acted as an interpreter in a second interview, even more dramatic than the first, in which the two Englishmen had menaced their prisoner with instant death if he did not comply to their demands. Finally, finding him proof against every threat, they had hurled him back into his prison, and after reproaching Manus with his treachery, which appeared from the newspaper advertisement, they had stunned him with a blow with a stick, and remembered nothing more until he was found us bending over him. And this was a singular case of the Grecian interpreter, and the explanation of which is still involved in some mystery. We were able to find out, by communicating with the gentleman who had answered the advertisement, that the unfortunate young lady came of a wealthy Grecian family, and that she had been on a visit for some friends in England. While there she had met a young man named Harold Littimer, and who had acquired an ascendancy over him, and had eventually persuaded her to fly with him. Her friends, shocked at the event, had contented themselves with informing her brother at Athens, and had then washed their hands of the matter. The brother, on his arrival to England, had unprudently placed himself in the power of Latimer and of his associate, whose name was Wilson Kemp, a man of the foulest accidents. These two, finding that his ignorance of the language, he was helpless in their hands, and kept him prisoner, and had endeavored to cruelly and starvation to make him sign away his own and his sister's property. They had kept him in the house without the girl's knowledge, and the plaster over his face had been for the purpose of making recognition difficult in case she should ever catch a glimpse of him. Her feminine perceptions, however, had instantly seen through the disguise when, on the occasion of the interpreter's visit, she had seen him for the first time. The poor girl, however, was prisoner herself, and there was no one at the house except for the man who acted as coachman and his wife, both of whom were tools of the conspirators. Finding that their secret was out, and that their prisoner was not to be coerced, the two villains with the girl fled away at the few hours' notice in the furnished house which they had hired, having first, as they had thought, taken vengeance upon the man who had defied and the man who had betrayed them. Months afterwards, a curious newspaper cutting reached us from Budapest. It told of how two Englishmen who had been traveling with a woman had met their tragic end. They had each been stabbed, it seems, and the Hungarian police were of the opinion that they had quarreled and had inflicted mortal injuries upon each other. Holmes, however, is, I fancy, of a different way of thinking that he holds to this day. If he could find the Grecian girl, one might learn how the wrongs of herself and her brother came to be avenged.